There is a moment, quiet, invisible, easy to miss, when a person decides they are done being small. It doesn't arrive with thunder. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up one ordinary morning, wearing the same clothes as every other day, sitting in the same chair, breathing the same stale office air. And then, something is said. Something is done. And the person who was once willing to let it pass, doesn't. That moment changed everything for Maya Reyes. And the 31 people who were in that conference room on a Tuesday in March will tell you, if you ask them, that they watched a woman become someone else entirely, right in front of their eyes. Not because she shouted. Not because she cried. But because she spoke. And the truth, when it finally comes out of someone who has held it too long, has a sound that silence never can. Maya Reyes was 34 years old and had spent the last 6 years of her life working at Callaway & Marsh, a mid-sized financial consulting firm based in downtown Chicago. She had come in as a junior analyst fresh out of graduate school, carrying 2 bags, a leather portfolio, and the quiet, relentless ambition of someone who had watched her mother work double shifts at a hospital laundry for 22 years and had promised herself silently, firmly, that the sacrifice would mean something. She was not the loudest person in any room she entered. She never had been. Growing up in a small apartment in Pilsen with her mother, her younger brother Carlos, and the ever-present smell of tamales and pine sol, Maya had learned early that observation was more powerful than noise. While other kids fought for attention, she watched. She listened. She remembered everything. It was a skill that made her exceptional at her job and invisible in her personal life, a trade-off she had quietly accepted without ever examining it too closely. At Callaway & Marsh, she had built her reputation the slow, honest way. She worked late when everyone else left. She double-checked numbers that senior analysts submitted without a second glance. She wrote reports that were so thorough, so precise, that her manager at the time, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia Lowe, had once held one up in a team meeting and said, "This is what good work looks like." Maya had felt the warmth of that moment for weeks. It had carried her through a lot of difficult days that followed. Patricia retired in 2021. And, with her retirement went the last person at Callaway & Marsh who saw Maya clearly. The man who took over the team was named Derek Holt. 48 years old, salt and pepper hair, the kind of handshake that lasted 1 second too long and the kind of laugh that filled a room but never quite warmed it. He had come from a larger firm in New York, brought in specifically because of his track record in restructuring underperforming divisions. He was sharp, no question about that. He knew the numbers. He knew the market. He knew exactly how to speak in meetings so that every sentence sounded like a conclusion rather than a suggestion. What Derek Holt did not know, or perhaps did not care to know, was how to see the people in the room. He had a way of looking past Maya when she spoke. Not aggressively. Not with open hostility. It was subtler than that, and somehow worse. He would glance at her during a meeting, nod once, and then turn his attention to the man sitting beside her as if the idea had come from him. He called her the analyst in conversations where everyone else had names. Once, when she had stayed until nearly 11 at night to finish a client projection report, a report that he then presented the next morning as the team's collective effort, he had passed her in the hallway and said, "Good hustle," without slowing his stride. She had stood in that hallway for a long moment, the words sitting in her chest like a stone. She told herself it was professional. She told herself he was busy, under pressure, adjusting to a new team. She told herself a lot of things in those first several months, because the alternative, admitting what she could see clearly, felt like a door she was not ready to open. Her friend and colleague, James Okafor, was not as patient with the narrative she was constructing. James had been with the firm for 9 years and had the particular wisdom of someone who had survived enough workplace politics to recognize a pattern when it showed up. He sat across from Maya at lunch one afternoon, 3 months after Derek's arrival, and said it plainly. "He doesn't think you matter." Maya had looked at him over her sandwich. "He's just adjusting." James had put down his fork. "Maya. He submitted your Q3 analysis under his own name on the client portal. I saw it. I wasn't going to say anything, but I saw it." She hadn't said anything for a long moment. She had known, in some wordless part of herself, that something was wrong. But, hearing it stated so plainly, so quietly, across a lunch table covered in paper napkins and plastic utensils, made it suddenly real in a way she could not step back from. "I'll talk to him," she said. "When?" James asked. She didn't answer, because she didn't know. The weeks that followed were a study in hesitation. Maya drafted a conversation with Derek in her head at least a dozen times. She rehearsed it in the shower, on the train, during the 15 minutes she sat in her car in the parking garage before going inside. She was not afraid of confrontation in the abstract. She had navigated plenty of difficult conversations in her life, with landlords, with her brother's school, with a former boyfriend who had mistaken her patience for permission. But this was different. Derek controlled her reviews. He controlled the assignments she received, the clients she was introduced to, the way the rest of the firm perceived her trajectory. Saying the wrong thing, or saying the right thing the wrong way, could quietly end 6 years of work. So she waited. And, while she waited, Derek continued. In October, the firm announced that it would be restructuring one of its largest client portfolios, the Callaway Healthcare account, which represented nearly 18% of total firm revenue. It was a complicated, high-stakes project that would require months of analysis, forecasting, and client-facing presentations. Derek formed a project team and appointed himself as lead. He chose 4 people from the department, 2 senior analysts named Brad and Connor, an associate named Simone, and, after what felt to those present like a visible afterthought, Maya. She was assigned to the data preparation. The background work. The infrastructure of the project that no one would see and no one would credit. Brad and Connor would handle the client presentations. Simone would manage communications. Maya would build the engine that made everything else run. She accepted this without comment and went to work. What followed was 3 months of the most demanding, precise, detailed financial modeling she had ever done. The Callaway Healthcare account was labyrinthine, decades of investment decisions layered on top of each other, subsidiary relationships that had never been properly mapped, risk exposure that had been buried under optimistic projections for years. Maya worked through it methodically, building a model so comprehensive that it became, effectively, the backbone of the entire project. She cross-referenced it against industry benchmarks. She identified 3 areas of risk that no one had flagged. She wrote a 47-page supplementary analysis that she attached to the team's shared drive at 2:17 in the morning on a Thursday in January, then drove home in the dark and slept for 5 hours before coming back. 2 days later, Derek forwarded the document to the client without attribution. When Brad mentioned in passing that the client had called it the most thorough preliminary analysis they'd received from any firm in years, Derek had nodded and said, "That's what good team management looks like." Maya had been standing 4 feet away, filling her coffee cup. He had not looked at her. That was October. November. December. January. 5 months of this. 5 months of building things and watching someone else take a bow. And then came the Tuesday in March. The meeting was called for 9 a.m. It was a full department gathering 31 people in the large conference room on the 14th floor, the one with the glass wall that looked out over Michigan Avenue. Derek stood at the front of the room with a presentation loaded on the screen behind him. The subject was the Callaway Healthcare project, which was now entering its final phase. There would be a major client presentation in 2 weeks. Derek was walking the department through the strategy, the findings, the narrative they would present. Maya sat near the middle of the long table. She had her laptop open and a notepad beside it. She had slept 6 hours. She was wearing a gray blazer she'd bought on sale at a thrift store in Wicker Park and had tailored to fit perfectly. She had a coffee that was going cold in front of her. She was listening. Derek moved through the slides. He talked about the risk analysis, her risk analysis. He talked about the investment mapping, her investment mapping. He used phrases she had written, frameworks she had built, conclusions she had reached after weeks of solitary, painstaking work. He spoke with the easy confidence of a man presenting ideas that he had long ago absorbed as his own. And then, a hand went up near the back of the room. It belonged to a newer analyst named Kevin Torres, who had only been with the firm for 7 months. He was earnest, a little eager, the kind of person who asked good questions because he genuinely didn't know the answers yet. "This is really impressive work," Kevin said. "The risk stratification model especially, how did we develop this? I'd love to understand the methodology." Derek paused. He glanced at his slides. He said, "It came out of the team's collaborative process. We've been building this framework for months." Kevin nodded, made a note. And something in Maya went very, very still. She looked at her notepad. She looked at her coffee. She looked at the window, where Chicago was gray and cold and very much itself beneath a February sky. She thought about her mother, who had worked the night shift for 22 years and whose hands were rough from it, and who had once told her, sitting at their kitchen table at 6 in the morning still wearing her work uniform, "Baby, the hardest thing you'll ever do is ask for what you've already earned." She thought about James saying, quietly, over a plastic fork, "He doesn't think you matter." She thought about 2:17 a.m. and a 47-page document and a phone call from a client that had made Derek Holt nod like a man taking a bow. And she raised her hand. Derek looked at her. He had the expression of a man who was not expecting to be interrupted but was willing to be briefly tolerant about it. "Maya," he said. "I can answer Kevin's question," she said. "About the methodology." Derek's expression shifted by a fraction, something careful moving behind his eyes. "We can circle back to process questions after I built the model," Maya said. Her voice was level. Not loud. Not sharp. Just precise. The risk stratification framework. The investment mapping. The 47-page supplementary analysis that the client described as the most thorough they'd received. "I built those. I think Kevin's question deserves a real answer." The room did not make a sound. Derek looked at her. The careful thing behind his eyes became something harder to read. "Maya," he said again, and this time there was a different texture to the word, a small, almost imperceptible tightening, the way a person's voice changes when they are calibrating how much authority to deploy. "Let's keep this on track." And then, he said it. He said, with the dismissive half-smile of a man who has never once had to consider the cost of being dismissive, "Hands off, okay? We're not doing attributions right now." He turned back to the screen. The room exhaled in a way that was not quite an exhale, a collective, almost inaudible adjustment, the kind that happens when 30 people simultaneously register that something uncomfortable just occurred and are deciding whether to acknowledge it. Maya did not look away from him. She set her pen down on the notepad. She folded her hands on the table. She waited exactly 4 seconds. She would think about those 4 seconds later, think about how they had felt like a door swinging open, and then she spoke. And the room shifted. Later, people would try to describe what exactly happened in the seconds after Maya Reyes began to speak. They would reach for different words. One person said it felt like the air pressure in the room changed. Another said it was like watching someone take off a coat they had been wearing so long, you had forgotten it wasn't their actual skin. James Okafor, who was sitting at the far end of the table, said later that he had stopped breathing without realizing it, and hadn't started again until she finished her first full sentence. What they all agreed on, every single one of the 31 people in that room, was that they felt it before they fully understood it. Something had changed. Not in the room. In her. She did not raise her voice. That is the first thing to understand. Maya Reyes did not yell. She did not cry. She did not shake or falter or reach for the performance of strength that people sometimes confuse with the real thing. She simply spoke at her normal volume, in her normal register, with the particular calm of someone who has decided, at last, that the truth is more important than the comfort of the people who have been avoiding it. "I'm not going to let that go," she said. Derek had already turned back to the projection screen. At the sound of her voice continuing, he turned again. His expression had moved from dismissive tolerance to something that was not quite annoyance but was clearly related to it, the look of a man recalibrating how much of a problem this was going to be. "Maya, I'm going to speak," she said. "And then, I'll be done." She looked around the room. Not with aggression. Not with a speech-making sweep of her eyes designed to perform confidence. She looked the way a person looks when they want to see who is present, really present, for something that matters. She looked at Kevin Torres, who had asked the honest question. She looked at Simone, who was sitting very still with her pen hovering over her notepad. She looked at Brad and Connor, who were both studying the table with sudden great interest. And then, she looked back at Derek. "My name is Maya Reyes," she said. "I've been with this firm for 6 years. For the last 3 months, I have been the primary architect of the analytical work behind the Callaway Healthcare project. The risk stratification model that Derek just walked us through, I built it. I designed the methodology, I ran the calculations, I identified the 3 risk vectors that no one had flagged before, and I wrote the 47-page supplementary analysis that the client called the most thorough they had received from any firm. I worked until past 2 in the morning on multiple occasions to produce that work." She paused. Not for effect. Just to breathe. "I am not raising this to create a problem," she continued. "I am raising it because Kevin asked a direct question, and he deserves a direct answer. And because the people in this room deserve to know who is actually doing the work they are being asked to evaluate, trust, and build on. That's not a personal attack. That's just the truth." The silence that followed lasted approximately 6 seconds. 6 seconds is not very long in most situations. In a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown Chicago office building, with 31 people around a long table and one of them having just said what Maya Reyes had said, 6 seconds was enormous. It sat in the room like a piece of furniture. Derek's jaw moved slightly. It was a small movement, barely visible, but several people noticed it. He was a man who was accustomed to controlling the frame of things. He was accustomed to being the one who defined what was happening and what it meant. And, for the first time in this space, someone else had done that. Someone he had spent nearly 8 months treating as invisible had stepped firmly, quietly, and irrevocably into view. He said, "I appreciate your passion, Maya, but this isn't the time or the place for when would be," she asked. It was not aggressive. It was a genuine question, delivered with the patience of someone who has asked it in her own head 100 times. "Because I've been trying to figure that out for a while. And I keep finding that there isn't one." Someone at the table made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a gasp. A small, involuntary exhalation, the sound of something being felt before it can be named. Simone, for her part, had set down her pen. She was looking at Maya with an expression that was difficult to read from across the table, a complex mixture of recognition and something that might have been relief. Derek straightened. He used his full height in a way that was subtle but deliberate, the body language of authority reasserting itself. "We can discuss workflow and attribution offline. Right now, I need to get through this presentation. We have a client deadline." "I understand," Maya said. "I'll let you get back to it." She picked up her pen. She looked down at her notepad. She had said what she came to say. But the room had not recovered. That was the thing. Derek moved back to the screen and resumed the presentation, and people looked at their laptops and made the appropriate expressions of engagement, but something had shifted in the atmosphere of that room and it did not shift back. The words Maya had spoken were still in the air. They had not dissolved, the way words usually do once a moment passes. They had settled on the table, on people's shoulders, behind their eyes, and everyone in that room would carry them out with them when the meeting ended. Kevin Torres, to his credit, had written down her name. He looked at what he had written, and then he looked up at her, and he nodded once. It was a small gesture. She saw it and was more moved by it than she expected to be. After the meeting ended, the room cleared in stages. Some people left quickly. Some gathered in small clusters, the way people do when something has happened that they need to process by talking around it without quite addressing it directly. Maya packed her things slowly and deliberately. She was not in a hurry. She had done the thing. Whatever came next, it would come. James found her in the hallway. He didn't say anything right away. He walked beside her for a few steps and then, he said, very quietly, "That was something." "Yeah," she said. "You okay?" She thought about the question honestly. Her hands were entirely steady. Her heart was not racing. She felt, unexpectedly, like she had put something very heavy down that she had been carrying for so long she had stopped noticing its weight. "I'm okay," she said. "Yeah." He nodded. Derek looked like someone had turned off his electricity. "I wasn't trying to embarrass him." "I know," James said. "That's what made it work." What happened next happened in layers, the way consequences always do when something real breaks the surface of a situation that had been sealed over for too long. The first layer was immediate. By noon that same day, two people had separately approached Maya in the office, not friends, not close colleagues, but people she recognized and said hello to in hallways. One of them was a woman named Rachel from the investment advisory team, who had stopped her near the elevator bank and said, quietly, "I just want you to know what you said in there. I've been there. More than once." She had squeezed Maya's arm and walked away without waiting for a response. The second was an older analyst named Stuart, who had 30 years at the firm and who Maya had always assumed occupied a different professional universe entirely. He had appeared in the doorway of her office that afternoon, knocked on the frame, and said, "Good work on the Callaway analysis, by the way. I read it. It's first rate." Then, he left. Neither of those things sounds, on the surface, like very much. But, after 8 months of being looked past, of nodding in doorways where your name is not spoken, of putting 47 pages of your brain onto a shared drive at 2 in the morning and watching someone else take a bow, being seen by two people, even quietly, even briefly, even without fanfare, felt like water on a very dry thing. The second layer took a few days longer. On Thursday, Maya received an email from Margaret Callaway. Not from the firm's point of contact. From Margaret Callaway herself, the 71-year-old founder of Callaway Healthcare, a woman who had built the company from a single clinic in Evanston over 40 years and who was, by all accounts, precise, demanding, and exceptionally difficult to impress. The email had been forwarded from the client portal with a note from the firm's managing partner, Alan Marsh, asking Maya to please come see him at her earliest convenience. She read the email twice before going. Margaret Callaway had written, "I have been reviewing the supplementary analysis that came with our project materials. I would like to know who prepared it. The level of insight, particularly regarding the subsidiary risk exposure in sections 4 and 7, suggests someone with an unusually clear understanding of how healthcare organizations actually function in practice, rather than in theory. I would like to speak with that person directly before we proceed to the final presentation. Please identify them." Maya read it twice and then sat with it for a moment. 3 months of work, pressed into sentences she had written in the dark, had traveled from a shared drive to a client's desk to an email to the office of the managing partner of Callaway and Marsh. And her name was at the center of it, whether Derek Holt had put it there or not. The truth had, in its own time and in its own way, attributed itself. Alan Marsh was 63, had the careful eyes of someone who had been reading people across conference tables for decades, and had the reputation of a man who prized revenue above most things but integrity above revenue. He was not warm exactly, but he was fair, and, in the landscape of things that mattered, that counted for a great deal. He asked her to sit down. He asked her directly whether she had produced the supplementary analysis. She said yes. He asked about the risk stratification model. She said yes. He asked about the investment mapping and the 3 flagged risk vectors. She said yes. He listened to each answer with the same careful, neutral expression and wrote nothing down. Then, he asked a different question. "How long has this been going on?" She did not pretend to misunderstand him. She told him. She told him about the months of work submitted without attribution, about the Q3 analysis James had seen credited on the client portal, about the team meeting where good hustle was the sum total of acknowledgement for an 11-hour day. She told him about Tuesday morning. She told him what Derek had said. Alan Marsh listened to all of it. When she finished, he thanked her and told her he would be in touch. She walked back to her desk and sat down and stared at her screen for a moment and thought, "Whatever happens, I told the truth." Whatever comes next, I told the truth. What came next surprised her. Not because justice arrived, swift and clean, in the way stories sometimes promise. Real life is messier than that, and Maya knew it. What surprised her was something quieter, less dramatic, and, in its own way, more meaningful than she had anticipated. Derek Holt did not disappear. He did not get fired on a Friday afternoon and escorted out of the building with a box of desk items. He was spoken to by Alan Marsh in a meeting that lasted 40 minutes and that Maya was not in the room for. He was reassigned, not demoted exactly, but moved to a different division, one with fewer direct reports and a smaller portfolio. It was the kind of consequence that would not make headlines but that anyone with experience in corporate institutions would recognize as significant. The kind of quiet reckoning that organizations reserve for people who are valuable enough to keep but have overstepped in ways that cannot be formally ignored. Maya was assigned as co-lead on the Callaway Healthcare final presentation. Her name appeared on the materials. When Margaret Callaway and her team arrived 2 weeks later for the final presentation, it was Maya who walked them through sections 4 and 7, the ones Margaret had specifically referenced in her email. She spoke for 22 minutes. Margaret Callaway asked her 4 questions and took 2 pages of notes. At the end, she looked at Maya and said, "You understand how this actually works." It was the highest compliment she gave to anyone. James heard the debrief and texted Maya one word, "Finally," she replied, not finally. Now because that was the distinction that mattered. It was not that justice had finally arrived after a long absence. It was that she had done something, on a Tuesday morning with cold coffee and a gray blazer and, for seconds of choosing, she had done something that opened a door. And, what had walked through it was not rescue. It was recognition. Her own, first. Then, everyone else's. But, that was not the end of the story. Not even close. Because the ripple of what Maya had said in that glass-walled conference room had traveled further than she knew. It had reached people she had never spoken to. It had started conversations behind closed doors and, in hallways and, in the parking garage. It had done the thing that quiet, real things do when they are finally said out loud. It had given other people permission. And, 3 weeks after that Tuesday morning, one of those people came to find her. Her name was Priya Nair. She was 29 years old, had been with the firm for 14 months, and had, until that moment, said almost nothing to Maya beyond polite greetings near the coffee machine. She appeared in the doorway of Maya's office on a Wednesday afternoon, and she looked like someone who had been working up to something for longer than the walk down the hallway. "I heard what you said," Priya said. "In the meeting." "Yeah," Maya said. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. Priya sat down. She put her hands in her lap. She looked at Maya with the expression of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally decided to put it on a table where someone else can see it. "I think the same thing has been happening to me," she said. "For about a year. And I didn't know what to do with it. I thought maybe I was wrong. I thought maybe I was being too sensitive. I thought maybe if I just worked harder, it would." She stopped. She looked at her hands. "And then, I heard what you said. And I realized I wasn't wrong." The office was quiet. Outside the window, Chicago moved through its afternoon. Maya looked at her for a long moment. She thought about what it had cost her to stay quiet for 8 months. She thought about 2:17 a.m. and cold coffee and a hallway and good hustle. She thought about her mother at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning, still in her uniform. "Tell me what happened," she said. And Priya did. There is something that happens when one person's courage becomes a mirror for another. It is not always visible from the outside. It doesn't always result in meetings and formal complaints and institutional responses. Sometimes it is simply 2 people sitting across from each other in a small office on a Wednesday afternoon, one of them saying, "I think the same thing happened to me," and the other one saying, "Tell me," and the world, for both of them, becoming slightly more honest than it was an hour before. That is a small thing by most measures. But small things, when they are the right kind of small, have the particular quality of changing everything they touch. Priya Nair talked for a long time. She spoke carefully at first, the way people do when they have rehearsed something but are discovering, in the moment of actually saying it, that rehearsal and reality feel very different. Her supervisor was a man named Warren Cole who had been with the firm for 16 years and was, by institutional standards, entirely above suspicion. He was well liked. He brought donuts on Fridays. He remembered people's birthdays and asked about their families and had a photograph on his desk of himself running a half marathon in a charity shirt. He was, in the specific way that makes certain patterns so difficult to address, professionally charming in every direction except the one where it cost him something. With Priya, it had started within weeks of her joining. Ideas she had shared in team emails would appear in Warren's presentations without credit. Proposals she had drafted would be forwarded to senior leadership with his name at the top. When she had stayed late to fix a data modeling error that was, in fact, Warren's mistake, an error that would have been embarrassing for the team if it had reached the client, he had thanked her by telling others he had caught it himself in review. She had sat with that one for 3 weeks, turning it over, wondering if she had misunderstood. She had not misunderstood. She had not said anything. She had told herself the same things Maya had once told herself: he is adjusting, the system rewards patience, it will correct itself. She had worked harder. She had produced better work. She had done the thing that people in her position are quietly encouraged to do. She had made herself impossible to dismiss on the basis of the work, not understanding that the dismissal was never about the work. Maya listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. She did not fill in the spaces with reassurance before Priya was finished speaking, because she understood, from the inside, that people who have been quieted for a long time need the experience of speaking without being managed. So she listened until Priya had said everything she had come to say. And, then, she sat with it for a moment before she responded. "Do you have records?" Maya asked. "Emails, timestamps, drafts with your name on them?" Priya looked at her. "Some. I kept some things. I wasn't sure why at the time. I think I was telling myself it was just in case." "Good instinct," Maya said. "Do you want to do something about this?" It was a genuine question, not a push. Because Maya had learned something in the last 3 weeks, something that the experience of speaking in that conference room had clarified in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. Courage is not a prescription. One person's decision to speak does not mean every other person in a similar situation must also speak, must speak in the same way, must reach the same outcome. What had worked for Maya, in her specific circumstances, with her specific history and her specific evidence, was not a template to be handed to everyone who walked through her office door. It was a data point. A possibility. An example of what the road might look like, not a requirement that it be taken. Priya thought about the question. She looked at her hands and, then, out the window and, then, back at Maya. "I want to not feel like I'm disappearing," she said. "I want to feel like I exist at work. That's what I want." Maya nodded. "Okay. Let's start there." What followed over the next several weeks was not a dramatic institutional crusade. It was something more modest and, in its own way, more durable. Maya met with Priya 3 more times over the course of a month, in the same small office, sometimes with coffee and sometimes without. She helped her organize what she had to the email threads, the draft documents with timestamps, the meeting notes she had taken and kept out of habit. She helped her think through who she could speak to, what she wanted to say, and what outcome she was actually hoping for, because those 3 things are different questions and the answers to them shape everything. She also did something simpler than any of that. She told Priya's name to people. When a piece of work that Priya had contributed to came up in conversation, Maya named her. When a question arose in a meeting that touched on something Priya had researched, Maya said, "Priya Nair actually looked at this closely. Priya, do you want to take that?" She did this without fanfare, without announcing that she was doing it, without asking for credit for the act itself. She just did it, steadily, the way you water something without making a production of the watering. Priya, for her part, began to straighten. Not overnight. Not in a single moment. But, over weeks, in small increments visible mostly to people paying close attention, she became more present. She asked more questions. She answered more questions. She began putting her name on things, not aggressively, not with the energy of someone making a point, but, matter-of-factly, the way a person does when they have been reminded that they are allowed to exist in a space. Alan Marsh, in the weeks following the Callaway healthcare presentation, had done some quiet investigating of his own. He had always known, in the general way that senior leaders often know things they choose not to examine too closely, that attribution and credit were imperfect at Callaway and Marsh. He had heard things over the years, vague, deniable things, the kind that exist in the margins of institutional life and that are easy to dismiss because they are never quite formal enough to require a formal response. Maya's account, delivered with specificity and documentation and the particular credibility of someone who had clearly chosen their words carefully rather than emotionally, had made those vague things harder to wave away. He brought in an external HR consultant to conduct a confidential review of the department's practices around project attribution and credit allocation. It was described internally as a workflow assessment, which was the kind of language organizations use when they want to address real problems while preserving everyone's ability to not have directly admitted that real problems existed. People who had been in the building long enough recognized it for what it was. People who hadn't been there long enough learned quickly from watching how others spoke about it in hushed voices near the elevator. The review took 6 weeks. Its findings were, as these things usually are, simultaneously obvious to people inside the situation and, apparently revelatory to the formal process. There were patterns. They were not confined to one manager or one team. They had been structural for long enough that they had become, in the quiet way that injustice tends to, simply the way things were. The report recommended 4 specific changes to how project contributions were documented, attributed, and reflected in performance reviews. Alan Marsh accepted all 4. He also did something that the report had not recommended, and that was, in the view of many who later heard about it, the most consequential thing he did. He called a full department meeting, the same glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor, the same 31 people plus a handful who had joined since March, and, he said, simply and, without lawyerly hedging, that the firm had not been doing enough to ensure that people received credit for their work. That this had affected people at the firm in real and measurable ways. That it was going to change, and that he expected everyone in the room to be part of making it change. He did not name Maya. He did not name Derek. He did not turn it into a story with heroes and villains, because he was a pragmatist and he understood that institutional change is more durable when it does not depend on the moral legibility of specific individuals. But everyone in the room knew. They had been in the other meeting. They had talked in hallways and parking garages and over lunches. They knew where the thread had started and whose hand had pulled it. James Okafor, sitting in almost exactly the same seat as before, sent Maya a text from inside the meeting room because she was at her desk. The text said, Alan's giving a speech. You'd like it, and then, a second text, 30 seconds later, he didn't thank you. But, he should have it, she read both and put her phone face down on her desk and went back to work, which was, really, what she had wanted all along. 6 months after that Tuesday in March, Maya was offered a promotion. The title was Senior Analyst Lead, which was a new title that had not existed at the firm before and which came with a team of 4 people, a seat at the monthly leadership table, and a salary that represented the largest single increase she had ever received. Alan Marsh delivered the offer himself, in a conversation that was brief and direct and contained one sentence she would carry for a long time. He said, "You should have been here 2 years ago. I'm sorry it took us this long." She did not say it was fine. She did not say thank you, it's okay, no worries. She said, I appreciate that. I'm glad to be here now. And that distinction between the performed gratitude of someone who has been trained to minimize their own inconvenience and the clear-eyed acknowledgement of someone who knows their own worth was small in the way that all the most important things are small. Just words. Just the precise arrangement of them. She accepted the promotion. Pre-Air, 2 months later, filed a formal complaint against Warren Cole with the firm's HR department. She did it with a folder of organized documentation and a 2-page statement she had written and rewritten 11 times. Warren Cole denied everything, as people in his position often do. The investigation, as investigations often do, ended somewhere in the gray. He was not fired, but he was placed on a formal performance improvement plan and removed from his supervisory role. Priya was transferred to a different team, a team where her manager was a woman named Lena Park who had a habit of saying people's names when she credited their work. Priya called Maya the evening the transfer was finalized. She called, not texted, which was meaningful in the way those choices are, and, she said, "I just wanted to tell you." Maya asked her how she felt. Priya thought about it for a moment and then said, "Like I showed up." Maya said, "Yeah. That's it exactly." They talked for 20 minutes about nothing important, about a restaurant Priya had tried, about a book Maya had abandoned halfway through, about the strange early warmth of that particular September. They talked the way people talk when the thing that was unsaid has finally been said and there is room now for ordinary things. What is a story like this about, in the end? It is tempting to say it is about justice. To wrap it that way, she was wronged, she spoke, things improved, she rose. That version exists. It is not entirely wrong. But it is thinner than the real thing. Because what Maya Reyes would tell you, if you asked her directly, is that it was never actually about Derek Holt. He was the occasion, not the subject. The subject was this: for 8 months, she had known something was wrong and had not said so, because she had made an internal calculation about what it was safe to name. That calculation had been wrong, not because the risks weren't real, they were, but because the cost of silence turned out to be higher than she had estimated. Not just professionally. In herself. The morning after she raised her hand in that conference room, she had driven to Pilsen and had breakfast with her mother at the same kitchen table where, years ago, her mother had told her about the hardest thing. Her mother had listened to the story and had asked a few questions and had then poured more coffee and said, in Spanish, which was the language she used for the things that mattered most, "Did you say it right?" And Maya had thought about it and said yes. And her mother had nodded and said, then, it was worth it. Whatever comes. It was worth it. That is the thing that does not fit neatly into a corporate case study or a management review or a new policy about attribution. The thing that is harder to measure and more durable than any of it. Maya Reyes sat in a room and told the truth about her own work. She did it without theater, without malice, with a steadiness that came from somewhere older than that job, older than that firm, older than that morning. It came from 22 years of watching hands that were rough from work, and a promise made at a kitchen table, and the long education of being underestimated by people who were too certain of their own position to look carefully at hers. It changed her. Not in the clean, cinematic way where a before and after can be drawn with a clear line. In the slower, less visible way where a person who had been half present becomes fully present. Where the energy spent on being invisible gets redistributed into the actual business of living. Where someone who had been good at their work becomes someone who was good at their work and willing to say so. She still comes in early most days. She still double-checks numbers. She still has the coffee that goes cold while she's thinking about something else. But she signs her name to things now in a different way, not differently on the page, but differently inside, with the knowledge of someone who has decided that her name is something worth signing. The 31 people who were in that room on a Tuesday in March have not forgotten it. Some of them have mentioned it, in various forms, to various people, in the years since. Some of them have thought about it quietly during their own moments of choosing. Kevin Torres, who asked the honest question, has said in more than one conversation that it was the most important meeting he ever attended at that firm, not because of what was on the agenda, but because of what happened when someone went off it. James Okafor still sits across from Maya at lunch sometimes, when schedules align. He still says what he thinks, which is one of the things she has always valued about him. On one of those lunches, not long after everything had settled, he had looked at her across the table and said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" She had asked what? He had said, "You waited 4 seconds. Before you spoke. I counted." She had looked at him. "I know. What were you thinking?" She considered it. "Then," she said, "I was thinking, this is the moment. And then, I thought, okay. Okay." He had nodded slowly. "Just okay?" "Just okay," she said. That was enough. And it was. It turned out that was exactly enough. Not a battle cry. Not a declaration. Not a performance for the room or for history or for anyone watching. Just a person, at a table, deciding that the truth was going to take up space now. That she was going to take up space. That she had earned that space, and she was not giving it back, and she was not going to wait to be handed it. She picked up her pen. She spoke. The room shifted. And she never went back to the place she'd been before.